Welcome to the ethics of forgiveness. This is not the psychology of forgiveness. This is not the theology of forgiveness. And this is not how to forgive. This is about philosophy. This is the ethics of forgiveness. So this is a general introduction to what philosophy has to say, what ethics in particular has to say about the practice of forgiveness. So let's get started. Discussion question. If someone apologizes after wronging you, do you have a moral obligation to forgive them? Possible answers include yes, no. It depends on the seriousness of the wrong. It depends on whether the apology is sincere. For example, whether it includes a confession, regret, and follow through. It depends on whether penance has been served. Your answer could be a combination of C and D. It could be a combination of D and E, or of C, D, and E. And finally, it could be, if someone truly wronged you, it would be immoral to forgive them. So I pose this question to my classes when we start this lesson. And the lecture I gave today, the responses were all over the map. So consider, forgiveness is a good thing, right? We don't want to be around unforgiving people. We'd rather be known as a forgiving person than an angry one. Forgiveness is a key to psychological health, right? Forgiveness is a key to marital harmony. If you want your marriage to last, you need to forgive one another. Forgiveness is a key to social and personal healing. And forgiveness is a key to social unity. Wouldn't you agree that we need more forgiveness in our society? So it's a good thing, right? So what's the philosophical question? Well, you'd be surprised maybe to find out that the philosophy of forgiveness, the idea of forgiveness, is very complicated. Consider these questions. What if I can't forgive them? What if they never apologize? How do I know whether the apology is sincere? If it is sincere, do I have to forgive? If I forgive them, does this mean I don't respect myself? If I forgive them, does this mean I condone what they did? If I forgive them, do I have to be reconciled to them? Or are forgiveness and reconciliation separate things? Is it okay to seek justice even after I've forgiven them? So in other words, I forgive you, but now I'm going to call the cops. Should I forgive them for what they did to my friends? Is this even possible, to forgive someone for what they did to someone else? So you can see now this is maybe more complicated than you first thought. So to explore the philosophy of forgiveness, we start off with Joseph Butler. Joseph Butler was an 18th century Anglican priest and philosopher, well known in the field of ethics. And when you start studying the philosophy of forgiveness, you have to start with Joseph Butler. So he's a key philosophical figure in the study of forgiveness. And he defines it as forswearing of excessive resentment, the forswearing of excessive resentment. So what that means, let's break this down. What is resentment? First, resentment is anger. And Butler distinguishes between two types of anger. There might be more, but he describes the first kind as hasty and sudden. So this is what happens when you stub your toe in the middle of the night. You're walking through the dark, you get angry. That's just the hasty and sudden kind, and it's not very philosophically interesting, at least to him. The second kind is settled and deliberate. So this is when someone wrongs you, when you feel they shouldn't have, and so you have these feelings well up inside of you. Call it resentment, call it revenge or vindictiveness. He calls it a negative reactive attitude at a perceived wrongdoing. And this notion of perceived wrongdoing is important because we probably have all had the experience that you, at one point, you thought you were wronged, but in fact you weren't. Or you thought this other person intended the action and they didn't. So perceived wrongdoing is what creates this reactive attitude. So what is excessive resentment? For Butler, this means experiencing anger at a level that interferes with the obligation we have to love our neighbors. Now, Joseph Butler is an Anglican priest. He's writing in the Christian tradition, and the primary or one of the most important ethical commands in Christianity is to love your neighbor. And so he thinks that anger is okay to the extent that it doesn't interfere with your ability to fulfill this commandment. So he says forgiveness is what love does when resentment interferes with it. In order to continue to love your neighbor, and as Christianity requires, love your enemy, you will forgive that person so that you can continue on obeying Jesus, obeying what Scripture requires of you. So if Butler is correct, then forgiveness has two dimensions. First, it's volitional. It involves an act of the will over the feeling of anger. And so that's maybe the main part of forgiveness. It involves you willing to do something. It involves you choosing to do something, even though you might not feel like it. But secondarily, it has an affective dimension as well. And I would argue, according to Butler, that as he ties it to the love of one's neighbor, that it has this other dimension as well, that loving one's neighbor involves one's emotions. And you see that in his sermons. And so I think that you can also tie forgiveness to that as well, that it involves some level of emotions. Well, perhaps you don't agree with Butler on the connection between forgiveness and loving one's neighbor. Maybe you're not a Christian. Maybe you don't see that as an obligation, especially the command to love one's enemies. But do you agree that there is such a problem as excessive anger or excessive resentment? And most of my students think that that's true, that there is such a problem. The question then is, how would you say, where would you draw the line? When does anger cross that line from appropriate anger to excessive anger? For Butler, again, it's about loving one's neighbor. If as long as it doesn't interfere, your anger doesn't interfere with loving your neighbor, then it hasn't crossed that line yet. So whether the line is the ability to love another or something else, perhaps forgiveness is the solution. So discuss this, consider this question. Is it possible to forgive someone who hasn't apologized? For example, wrongdoers may feel they've done nothing that requires an apology. Can you still forgive them? So this asks a conceptual question about even the possibility of forgiveness. It's not asking whether it's right to do so, whether you ought to. It's asking whether it's even possible. So for some people, forgiveness is a two-way street, or it involves interaction. It's a social practice. You can't have it unless you have two parties. So then forgiveness for them is not even possible unless you've got two people present. But consider this question. Can you forgive a dead wrongdoer? The person wrongs you and then subsequently dies. Can you still forgive? If your answer to this is yes, then it's not apparent that this is a social practice. It seems more like it's something that just happens within the victim or the person who's been wronged. So a negative answer to these questions may indicate that you think that forgiveness is defined more as a social practice requiring two parties and less as a psychological phenomenon requiring only one. So that's the question, is forgiveness an internal or external practice? That's one important philosophical question. One of the main questions is it internal or is it external? Is it something that you can do just in your own heart? Or does it require two parties to be involved? The next question is it permissible to forgive someone who hasn't apologized? So this is the moral question. For example, wrongdoers may feel they've done nothing that requires an apology. Can you still forgive them? So if you think that forgiveness should always be dependent upon or conditioned upon the wrongdoer recognizing they were wrong, confessing they were wrong, apologizing and repenting, then you might think that it's not permissible to forgive someone who hasn't already apologized. So perhaps the wrongdoer doesn't understand what she's done, and the victim's sustained anger is necessary to produce this effect. So being angry then is what is morally required. You got to stay angry in order to communicate to the wrongdoer that what they've done is bad. Or perhaps apologizing too quickly means failing to recognize the moral seriousness of the wrong. So if you're too quick to apologize or forgive, I'm sorry, if you're too quick to forgive, maybe you yourself don't recognize how serious this situation, this action was. Or perhaps apologizing too quickly represents a lack of self-respect. So if you're always if you're, actually this should be, sorry, this should be forgiveness, my bad again. Forgiveness too quickly represents a lack of self-respect. If you forgive too quickly and you're always forgiving, then maybe it's because you don't respect yourself. So this is the question. Does it involve a certain amount of self-respect? Does it violate a certain amount of self-respect? So next, are there times when forgiveness should be withheld from wrongdoers even when they are apologetic and repentant? So this is related to the previous question, but there are some other situations that are important to consider. So again, perhaps forgiving too quickly demonstrates a lack of self-respect, or perhaps the wrongdoer's action is part of a more pervasive problem, and the victim has an obligation not to forgive because doing so would weaken her solidarity with other victims, real or potential, or represent a failure to condemn the larger problem, for example, racism or misogyny. Is there a right to forgiveness? So if there's an obligation to forgive, could we frame this in terms of rights? In other words, if a wrongdoer satisfies certain conditions, does the wronged person or the victim commit a wrong in withholding forgiveness? So if you think that forgiveness is contingent upon apology, and if someone has apologized, then the victim has an obligation to forgive, perhaps it's because the wrongdoer has a right to continue to live his or her own life. And that might require having someone release them from their debt, in a sense. Okay, so does that mean that there's a right then to forgiveness, the right that someone else has a responsibility to attend to, that someone else being the victim? Is forgiveness a life good for the wrongdoer, one that only the victim can give? If a victim is presently unable to forgive, is there at least an obligation to work toward forgiveness? So if you feel that there's this strong obligation to forgive, maybe you're not so comfortable with rights talk, but you still think that as long as an apology has been given, at least if an apology has been given, that there should be forgiveness. It does feel a bit insensitive to say to require of a victim, you know what, you need to forgive. Okay, your wrongdoer has apologized, so then you need to forgive. So it does seem a bit insensitive, but you might be able to still hold on to this strong obligation to forgive if you frame it in this way. You say that it's not an obligation that holds or pertains right now, but it's something that you have an obligation to work toward. Forgiveness is something you need to work towards even now. You don't need to forgive today, but the aim should be in the future. The aim should be forgiveness. So also, is forgiveness an obligation or simply an act of supererogation? So obligation means duty. Do you think that forgiveness is a duty, whether after an apology or not? Or do you think that it's just something that it's cool if you do it, but you're not blameworthy if you don't? If that's the case, it's an act of supererogation. So obligation means duty, supererogation means beyond the call of duty. So next question, who can forgive? So this just keeps getting more and more complicated, this topic. Can only the victim forgive? Or can the family, friends, and strangers also do so? Would it be wrong for someone else, like a mother, to forgive the wrongdoer for something done to someone else? Can you forgive someone for wrongs that were committed not by that person, but by other people from their country, possibly a previous generation? So here we're introducing this sense of community identity or obligations of solidarity. Should capital punishment, criminal punishment be pursued even when the victims and their families have forgiven? It could be capital punishment as well, but we're talking in general criminal punishment. if the families of the victims and the victims maybe even themselves have forgiven, should the courts continue to pursue justice? Consider what Botham Jean's brother said to his brother's killer at the trial. And if you don't recall this, this was the case of the Dallas police officer who shot Botham Jean in his apartment. And at the trial, this actual video went viral when Botham Jean's brother took the stand. I think this was the impact statement, and said to the police officer, I think her name was Amber Geiger, quote, "I forgive you. I love you just like anyone else. I don't even want you to go to jail." So you can imagine, I don't think he did this, but him turning to the judge and asking the judge to please not sentence her to jail and not to incarcerate her. So that's the question here. Now we have forgiveness on the part of the victim's family. Should there be criminal punishment? Consider another case. Consider Rachel Denhollander, what she said to the judge after offering Larry Nassar her forgiveness in her victim impact statement. So this was the case of the USA Gymnastics doctor who did horrible things. And this was during the trial, actually during the sentencing phase, when the impact, I think the impact statements were going on. And Rachel Denhollander was one of the first people to come out and claim accuse Larry Nassar of what he did. She said in the course of her victim impact statement that she forgives him, that that's part of her Christian story was to forgive him. But at the very end of her victim impact statement, she turns to the judge and says this, quote, "Send a message that these victims are worth everything. I plead with you to impose the maximum sentence under the plea agreement because everything is what these survivors are worth." So here, the difference between these two cases is one, you got forgiveness in both, but in one you have a request for mercy, and the other you have a request for justice. So now, going a little deeper into the philosophical background in forgiveness, here we have Friedrich Nietzsche. And so this is the topic or the question of whether forgiveness is an act of altruism or is it self-focused, or should it be both? So Friedrich Nietzsche has this philosophy of forgiveness that I want to call the shake it off philosophy. Taylor Swift, in connection to Taylor Swift's song, Shake It Off. And basically he says that forgiveness amounts to shaking it off, if you can call it that at all. So it's not really an act of altruism, it's more self-focused. He says, quote, "A good example of this is in the modern world is Mirabeau, who had no memory for any insults and meanness which were practiced on him, and who was only incapable of forgiving because he forgot. Such a man indeed shakes off with a shrug many a worm which would have buried itself in another. It is only in characters like these that we see the possibility of the real, quote, love of one's enemy." Here he's talking about Christianity, right? And so for him, you don't forgive for the sake of the other, for the sake of the wrongdoer. You forgive in spite of the other. You forgive as a way of moving on with your own life. So that other person is nothing more, as he says here, than a worm to you. He continues on this. Well, he says on this view of forgiveness, forgiveness is a type of letting go in his view, a letting go of resentment, but it only concerns the other insofar as the other is the object of one's anger. So forgiveness is not for the sake of the other, and it does not lead to reconciliation or involve any concern for the other. This is consistent with saying, quote, "I forgive you, but you can die for all I care." Question to you is this real forgiveness? And by the way, that quote isn't what Nietzsche said, but that's my interpretation of it. So now we have Martha Nussbaum in her book, Anger and Forgiveness, 2016. She argues that garden variety anger is morally problematic because it makes one of two errors. So her book is against anger, at least certain types of anger, and for a certain type of forgiveness. She says that anger is both narcissistic and cruel. So it's narcissistic insofar as it focuses on one's status in relation to the wrongdoer. It's very self-focused. It's cruel because it thinks that making the wrongdoer suffer makes the world a better place. And so in every impulse of anger, you have this desire to take revenge or cause the wrongdoer some sort of suffering, maybe equivalent suffering that you've suffered. And that kind of revenge just is that's just cruel, she says. She argues that the only kind of anger that is morally permissible is transition anger, anger that is directed at socially constructive outcomes. Such an anger may be intense, but it aims to change the world so that wrongs like this don't occur. So anger is okay in her book as long as it's not pointed at an individual. You should forgive the individual, take that anger and redirect it to some socially constructive ends, like joining a victims advocacy group or something. She believes that forgiveness should be defined as unconditional love and generosity toward our fellow human beings. And she illustrates this forgiveness by comparing it to the unconditional love of the Father in the prodigal son parable. So in Luke 15, the story of the prodigal son is this story of a disobedient son who takes his inheritance and goes off and squanders it in another land. He violates certain social norms involving inheritances and just ruins his life. In absolute embarrassment and humility, he comes back to his father and just begging to be even to work as a servant in his father's house. And his father, instead of being angry, just when he sees his son coming up the road, just runs out with his arms spread and embraces him and throws a party for him. He's just so happy that his beloved son is back. And so Nussbaum thinks this is a picture that should help us understand forgiveness, anger and forgiveness in life more generally. So this is compatible with anger, but not anger directed at the wrongdoer. And as one of her examples, in fact, she uses Martin Luther King Jr., who is an example of transition anger. And Martin Luther King also talks about forgiveness as well. But what you have in Martin Luther King Jr., someone who's very socially active, who was fighting against the evils of his time, but was doing it in such a way that she thought was morally praiseworthy. And here we have a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. who says, "There is some good in the worst of us and some evil in the best of us. When we discover this, we are less prone to hate our enemies. When we look beneath the surface, beneath the impulsive evil deed, we see within our enemy neighbor a measure of goodness and know that the viciousness and evilness of his acts are not quite representative of all that he is. We see him in a new light. We recognize that his hate grows out of fear, pride, ignorance, prejudice, and misunderstanding. But in spite of this, we know God's image is ineffably etched in his being. Then we love our enemies by realizing that they are not totally bad and that they are not beyond the reach of God's redemptive love." So that brings us to the sunflower, and this is Simon Wiesenthal's Sunflower. Wiesenthal was an Austrian Jew and a Holocaust survivor. After the war, he spent his life hunting down Nazis and educating others about the Holocaust. The book, The Sunflower, tells the story of his encounter with a dying Nazi officer during the war, who asked for his forgiveness. Unsure of his choice, Wiesenthal solicited the opinions of many respected figures to determine what they would have done in his place. So the first half of this book is the case itself. And the case involves him during the war being, he was on a work party near a hospital, and as he tells the story, a nurse came out to retrieve him and brought him to a hospital bed where there was a Nazi soldier dying. And it's not because the soldier knew him or he knew the soldier, but the soldier wanted some sort of wanted somebody to confess his sins to before he died. And so he just wanted the nurse to bring him any Jew from the streets. And so when he gets to the room, the soldier confesses his sins. And in the case, you hear about all the terrible things that he did to Jews, and asks Wiesenthal to forgive him. And what happens? Well, Wiesenthal doesn't just walk out, but he doesn't forgive him either. He doesn't offer him his forgiveness or unforgiveness. He just remains silent. And so in the years that followed that, he survived, obviously. And in the years that followed that, he questioned himself whether he did the right thing in the room. So he asked his friends, and he asked many experts in ethics and religion to answer this question of his, whether he did the right thing. And he compiled those responses in this book. The second half of the book include those responses. So it's a very interesting read, highly recommended. Here are some of the some of the replies, a sample of the replies to Wiesenthal in the second half of The Sunflower. Abraham Joshua Heschel says, quote, "No one can forgive crimes committed against other people. It is therefore preposterous to assume that anybody alive can extend forgiveness for the suffering of any one of the 6 million people who perished." Dalai Lama says in the book that the Buddhist way is to have compassion on wrongdoers, even those responsible for the worst crimes against humanity. That's my paraphrase of his essay. Desmond Tutu says, quote, "It is clear that if we look only to retributive justice, then we could just as well close up shop. Without forgiveness, there is no future." All right, so there are actually many other dimensions to the philosophy of forgiveness, which are explored in other books, including some of these I'll mention here for you. There's a series in the philosophy of forgiveness called The Philosophy of Forgiveness on Vernon Press. And there are currently 4 volumes. Another one's coming out soon. I am the editor of 2 of those, so I would recommend that if you're interested in going deeper. But some of the essential readings in the philosophy of forgiveness or the ethics of forgiveness are the following. I would highly recommend this book, Forgiveness, A Philosophical Exploration by Charles Griswold. I would recommend anything by Geoffrey Murphy, including this one, Forgiveness and Mercy, which is co-authored by Geoffrey Murphy and Gene Hampton. And I would also recommend Geoffrey Murphy's Punishment and the Moral Emotions. I would also recommend Glenn Pettigrove's Forgiveness and Love, and Martha Nussbaum's Anger and Forgiveness, which I've already talked about. Okay, well, I hope you found that helpful, and good luck learning more about forgiveness.